All right. Welcome everyone to our third and final class on our brief study here of the Beatitudes. Today we're going to be covering the last three, some people say four, I'll call it 3.5 of the Beatitudes. So it's about the pure in heart, the peacemakers, those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, and then those who are reviled and persecuted on my account, which in many ways, some people look at that last one as a separate one. More scholars kind of link it to the eighth one and use it. They see it more as an aside to the disciples in front of him, who he knows are going through certain persecutions and specific things. Plus, it's Matthew's way of alluding to the very, very exact persecutions that Jesus is going to go through. So there's some of that. That's partly what's happening here. Let's see. So as we get into this, I just want to say one more thing, moving into our last week here. I hope what we've been able to accomplish, in part anyway, with this study of the Beatitudes is this idea that sometimes, this is true for so many aspects of Bible study, but sometimes when we look at something like the Beatitudes, we've been trained or told or taught to look at them as if they describe someone external to us, okay? Someone that we look at. So for instance, those first three that we started with. So blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are those who are hungry and thirsty for righteousness specifically. We often look at that as if it describes some type of socio-economic condition, when in reality, Matthew, there's ample room within the text. And really, when you take the whole of the gospel into consideration, this is probably, and I would make the argument that it is, but I'll say probably, this is probably not about describing economic or social condition, and more about describing something I'll call religious virtue. And that is to say that to talk about blessed are the poor in spirit is not to say, oh, yes, God sees them. God loves them in their condition for those things that they can't control. I don't want to downplay that. I think that is true. There is a preference for the poor. But more than that, if we are to be a follower of Jesus, then being poor in spirit, being poor in alignment with all of those around us who are struggling, is crucial to walking that walk, that we see one another. We're not just wearing blinders all the time, walking around only concerned about ourselves. So to be poor in spirit means to live with a sense of alignment and not superiority, not pity, but engagement. Same with being a mourner. Blessed are those who mourn. Sometimes we look at that and say, oh, it's so hard sometimes. Life is hard. And those who are sad and mourning, God lifts them up. That is true. But in the context of the Beatitudes, it also means, and I think even more powerfully might mean, that if you are going to walk this Jesus walk, to be a mourner means that you are a complete, that you more fully experience your own and others' humanity. And that only as we mourn, only as we go into those places, the darker places of our life, can we fully and appreciably know what love is. So this is kind of the movement here. The Beatitudes are not about externalizing any of this and saying, oh, well, they're blessed because God loves them and God sees them. It's not about that and putting that on others, because that sort of takes a certain responsibility away from us. The Beatitudes are about our charge, our role in seeing one another, in understanding relationships. Those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, it's not just those who are longing for righteousness because they don't get any outside of us. No, it's those of us who live lives that are motivated by the hunger and the thirst for righteousness and justice, not by material possessions, not by the stuff we can get and all the accolades. Do you see the difference? And so Matthew is constantly talking about this idea that the Beatitudes describe our responsibility, our role, our opportunity to walk this walk that Jesus walks. This is sort of, as I said at the beginning, a greatest hits of what it means to follow Jesus. So he's playing these songs because he knows that these are the crucial songs, the crucial aspects of what it looks like to walk that walk with Jesus. Okay. Questions and comments then about as we move into this last portion then for this week. Horty.
And what about the invitation to apply these concepts to ourselves and see if we walk in that footstep of being that person that's described in each of the Beatitudes? When we are poor in spirit, blessed are we when we allow ourselves to be in those receptive places.
Absolutely. Yeah. I offer what I just said as a both and, not as an either or so much, but I like to emphasize the responsibility role, because I do think that in our culture, we do tend to read these texts from a very individualized place. It just is the way that we're often taught them. And I believe that the gospel writers, and in this case, Matthew in particular, were always more focused on the relationship to the community, and that the health of the community was really what was at stake here. And we tend to look at these as if they pertain to only us. But I think, Horty, you're right. If I'm hearing you correctly, it's that this is about allowing ourselves in our own lack or in our experience of struggle or poorness of spirit or our mourning to know that we are still upheld by a God who sees us and loves us. And more than that, by a community that holds us through that too. And that's a challenge for many of us, I think, if we're honest, a lot of times to be in those places and still feel whole, still feel a part of, still feel accepted. I go back to that old example that so many people, and maybe this is just an excuse to get me off their back, but if I ever say, I haven't seen you in church in a while, and they will sometimes say, well, I just been really having some struggles at home. I've been having some hard things happening, and I wanted to wait till I got everything together before I came back to church. And okay, I recognize that just might be a line. But if that is at all true, then it's a suggestion that we're missing the point of the community we call church. If we can't, or if we feel we're just not allowed to come to a place and be known and seen and loved through all of it, I know there's more to it than that, but that's a part of this. So yeah, it's about a widening of our appreciation of the Beatitudes into that larger, level, that communal level on top of the individual. Any other thoughts or comments? Marilyn? Still muted here.
Okay, how about
there we
now?
go.
Okay. One of the things I've noticed about myself as I've gotten older is that I'm more aware of my need to ask sort of other people as well as God for help, to sort of admit that I'm right now feeling kind of poor of spirit. And asking other people for help turns out just to be wonderful. It's not embarrassing. They don't think less of me.
Right. And I think that's the symbiotic nature of what these Beatitudes represent, because even as they invite us to that place of acceptance within our own experience, they then draw us to that place of, oh my gosh, I am no better or different than you. And my ability to ask you to come into my life, to walk with me, is reflective of my willingness to see the connections in the same way between all people. It leads one to a more humble view of what it means to be alive, and less sort of, me standing on my own, coattails or whatever only, and it's about my success. So I think one leads to the other. And to see that and accept that within ourselves enables us or encourages us to see it and accept it in other people. That's how life happens. And the truth is, that's how it always has happened. It's just that we've, different times of our lives, we've seen it differently, or we've been taught that we need to act differently. But I think in part, as you say, as we get older, we come to a different perspective, maybe a different wisdom about it. Bob, and then Bonnie.
Well, when you're talking about community and the Beatitudes, it reminds me of the part of the Lord's Prayer that you demonstrated to me about give us this day our daily bread. It's not just myself, my own bread. It's the community.
Yes. And it's true, and it's always said that, right? That line's always been there, but a lot of us sort of, it's not something we often think about, but it is something that we have internalized, that my relationship with God is a God to me thing, and we don't spend as much sort of spiritual effort connecting the dots that link us to one another as an expression of God alive in our world. So I think it's always good to notice that, because it's often always been there. I saw Bonnie's hand up.
When you mentioned that people want to make sure everything's right before they come back to church, they don't want to go if they're struggling. It reminded me of how I feel about the doctor. I need to lose weight. I think you've all seen me. You all know that. But I don't want to go back to the doctor until I've lost weight and I'm looking great and everything's, and I'm really healthy. I don't want to go back and have him say, oh my God, I haven't seen you in 2 years. You've only lost a pound, I mean, so it's kind of like the same thing going to church, like,
Yeah.
You want to be everything rosy and everything right with God and
there
right
it is.
everybody
Yes.
and not go when you're or you might be having problems. Maybe you're not even aware of it.
That's what it is. There's something in us that's like this received thing that we have to be acceptable by a certain standard in order to be really loved, to receive love. And that's just what the gospel messages, I think, in general work against. But I fall victim to that. I don't know. My thing is, like, about a week or two before I have a dentist appointment, I start flossing. And so, and I get my teeth as clean as possible. So that I'll get that, wow, you've done a great job. And I'll be like, fooled them again. It's so silly, but it's what I do because I just don't. Anyway, it's just part of what I'm trying to sort of live into, that same attitude that you named with your doctor, so small thing, but it's not necessary. Go ahead, Patty. Unmute still. Yeah.
One of the things that has occurred to me in studying this and the other things we've studied is how the Beatitudes relate to the other major teachings that Jesus has.
Yeah.
Things like the New Covenant, the Lord's Prayer, the Passover meal where he gave a ritual for remembering, and there's a bunch of other ones. The feeding of the 5,000 and 4,000 miraculously. And all of those, I've always seen those as separate things, but they're not separate things.
Right.
They are extremely integrated into the whole idea of a kingdom of heaven that is with us now.
Yes.
And that's an amazing thing to see.
Right.
It's more meaningful. And I think, okay, this is essentially in all of the four gospels, but it's also very, very profound in Matthew.
Yes.
In Matthew, really, whoever Matthew was, he really did a good job on this in terms of the integrity of it. Mm-hmm. And how it almost is psychologically structured to take us in, to allow us to accept something that's so novel and so radical. Because this was radical thinking. It's not right, you guys, that the old way that we saw things in the is not what God was talking about. And the kingdom of heaven isn't about power over, it's about power with.
Yes.
And I mean, it's just extremely interesting to me.
Yes. And it's so good that you say what you said, and yes to all of that. But for us, as we read these things, they are very seldom, if ever, meant to be discrete in and of themselves. But once again, because of the way we tend to digest the Bible, whether it's simply at church when you hear the little bit that I or other ministers preach on, or how we do Bible study, it's an episode here, it's something there. It's easy to lose that sense of continuity, to lose that sense of connection between all these things, and they are all integrated. And the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount is, as I was saying early at the beginning, it's sort of like this greatest hits. It's this sort of digestion. Here's the essentials. Okay. And yeah, there's a lot of hard stuff, and it's incredibly radical. And then the rest of the gospel really helps flush that out and really open it up. But this kind of gives us a leaping off point. And it's so important for us to recognize how radical it really is. Not only in terms of his gospel is about taking it up a notch. It's the Emerald Lagasse of the gospel writers, okay? He is always about, you've heard this, but I say. That's what Matthew's sort of approach to the gospel is, and to Jesus' way of teaching. And the Beatitudes kind of express that way of living. You heard that's, it's okay, you follow a teacher and you dedicate your life. Okay, well, here's what that looks like. Boom, you're going to do this and this and this. If you want to say you're a follower of me, if this is what you desire, then here's what it looks like. Not a threat, but it's very clear and it's very challenging. And that's part of what Matthew's tact is the whole way. And that's why he has to spend 28 chapters talking about this, because he knows it's challenging. He knows it's radical. He knows that it is, as Patty said, a redefinition of what power looks like. And we'll get to this. We've got Pax Romana and Pax Christi. That means the peace of Rome versus the peace of Christ. What does Rome's peace look like? We'll get to that. But I think because we still live in an age where we practice peace through strength. And peace through violence, whereas Christ's version of peace, much different. So it is radical. And if we don't read this and feel the radicality of it, then we've either just not given ourselves to really seeing it, like we've distanced ourselves from it, so we're missing something in it, or there's something else going on, that we've just we've lost touch with what the walk with Jesus really is meant to do. So was there another? Yeah, Bob, and was there also someone else? I wanted to make sure.
Yes, yesterday I was listening to KVMR, and I don't know, they didn't say who the artist was, but he was singing about all the things you can have in life, but if you don't have peace, what does it matter? An interesting song. I never heard it before.
Mm-hmm. Well, and then it's about the definition of peace. Is peace the calm within? Is peace the absence of strife? Or is peace something else? And we'll get to that, because that's one of our Beatitudes for today, talks about peace. So not to give it away, let's hold back on that. Okay. Any other comments before we get into reading?
And the cheesemakers.
And the cheesemakers, yes. It's funny you said that. We were, for our trivia night last week, I got to pick the bonus topic, and I picked Monty Python. And so that was one of the questions had to do with the life of Brian. And I was like, yep, that is on my top 5 of religious movies. I don't often advertise that, but
it's just a flesh wound.
Oh yeah, that one too. Hey, could I get, 3 volunteers for reading? Because we're going to read a portion from Matthew, and we're going to cover the rest of the Beatitudes, but also some of the follow-up commentary, because we'll get to that. It's like, what does this all look like? What does it all mean? Well, Matthew starts to touch on that. So I want to cover what he says. Plus, then there's a little bit from Luke today. So could I get 3 volunteers for our reading? Marilyn and Bonnie and Horty. Okay, we'll go in that order. So Marilyn and Bonnie, you split the Matthew passage, if you will, and I'll kind of help you with that here. Let's see. What am I doing here? There we go. Yay. All right. Can you all read that? Yeah. All right. So Marilyn, if you would read through verse 12, start with 8 and go to 12. And then I think it was Bonnie finishing the Matthew passage there.
Through 12?
Yeah, you read 8 through 12, please.
Okay. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you.
Bonnie?
You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? Is it no longer good for anything, but is thrown out and trampled underfoot? You are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hid. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under a bushel basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven.
Wonderful. So that sort of ties in all of Matthew's the way he presents the Beatitudes, and then this is the tail end of Luke here that pertains to today's. So just these few verses. Horty, would you please read those?
Blessed are you when people hate you, and when they exclude you, revile you, defame you on account of the Son of Man. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy, for surely your reward is great in heaven, for that is what their ancestors did to the prophets. Woe to you when all speak well of you, for that is what their ancestors did to the false prophets.
Okay, and that is Luke's style. He does the blessings and woes, so it's a little bit different, but he's communicating some of the same ideas that Matthew does here. All right, so let's just get right into it. We'll kind of just travel through each one of those as best we can and hopefully entertain all sorts of other comments and questions that you might have. But as we start the reading today, at least in the Matthew one, he talks about blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. And I want to ask that how does being pure in heart relate to seeing? What is the connection between how we, if our heart is pure, that we might see God? You ever think of that? How is sight and connected to a pure heart? Patty?
I wanted to share what I read in my Aramaic translation because I think it's apropos. Is that okay with you? It's short.
Oh, that'd be great. Sure.
He says, pure in heart is an Aramaic idiom. It refers to a sincere, contrite individual. It also means a person with a clear mind. A clear heart and mind perceives God. To see God is to know the ever-present divine presence, God's immanence. And when the mind and the emotions are clouded, one does not perceive the good that is present. The mind is the mirror of the soul. A spotted mind cannot reflect a clear image, and it is the same with the mind. Thus, when the mind is filled with hatred and resentment, it cannot reflect goodness. All of humankind's actions, good or bad, begin in the mind. And when the mind is clear, it reflects the goodness of God. And then we see God.
Yeah, there's a connection. Yeah, it's beautiful. And that idea of the clarity of our seeing and our thinking as being connected to the clarity within ourselves of the heart at that point would have been kind of considered the seat of decision making, the seat of all of our of bringing everything together. So your head and your eyes and all that. And what you just read reminded me of that line that Jesus, I think it's also from no, it's not from Matthew, but it's from Luke, where he says the eye is the lamp of the body. And so the clarity with which the eye can take in the light sort of illuminates all within. So there's this deep connection between what we see and how we experience what we see. And then, as this is saying, you know, when we are pure in heart, we then, it sort of encourages us to learn to see, the word you used was immanence, the deep presence in all things of God. And there's a connection there. To the pureness of our heart.
And I think that when one can do that, like St. Francis, for example, then and of course Christ, they reflect God. I mean, it's like the invitation is for us to be at one with God, that we may also just radiate that.
Yeah.
That's part of the way that we draw others to God, is if we can become like that.
Yes.
And know that. And that's not so easy.
No, it's not. Because, well, let's start this way. When you think of the idea of pure in heart, who comes to mind? If anyone. And it doesn't have to be someone specific. It might be a group, some type of group of people even. But what do you think of when you think of pure in heart? Who is pure in heart? Ken?
It reminds me of Soren Kierkegaard because he wrote a book by that title.
Yes, I love Soren Kierkegaard.
Mother Teresa.
Ah, okay. Barb?
I'm thinking of two other mystics, Therese of Lisieux, the little French girl who lived a very short life and had some very profound things to say about relationship to God, and also Julian of Norwich.
Yep. Yeah, so certainly mystics in their experience of God have this, I think of Teresa of Avila as another one, who is the one that wrote that famous poem that that got translated to that song Kindness that we sing. You know, Christ has no body but ours. You know, the hands and hearts that we have are ours. And there's a pureness in that spirit, in the heart of her. Before I carry on and kind of connect some of these dots you've listed up, I love all these examples. Anyone else? Any other people come to mind? Oh, go ahead. Yeah, Bertie.
Yeah, I think of little children.
Yes. That's what comes to mind for me too. It's another one. There's that, and I think that's one of the connections that the gospel makes, because that story later, let the children come to me. Children are so pure in heart. And I think some of what happens as we become adults is that we lose some of that. And we might call it innocence, but it's that sense of trust and of seeing the God-breathed presence within all things and all beings. We start to lose our ability to see that, sometimes because we lose the ability to see it in ourselves, or we start to move to these places as we grow older. Maybe when we hit adolescence, we hit those places where all of a sudden it's about comparison and our sense of lack in what we just all previously kind of freely accepted that was a part of everyone to varying degrees, but still, that we all were connected to. But then we start to define and separate, and then our sense of ourselves can kind of be impacted by that. So call that spots on the lens, or things that dull the purity of the heart or impact it. And we start to lose that ability to see the presence of God, both in ourselves and in the way we used to, and then in those around us. And then that impacts our ability to respond and to live into the fullness of the Jesus walk. Was there another hand? Okay, I thought I saw some movement. Go ahead, Bob.
I was wondering about your thoughts on the Amish as far as a community that is pure in heart. Do you have thoughts of that? I'm not real familiar with them, but I just wanted your thoughts on it.
Well, I mean, I think insofar as any community, that seeks to define itself and to create a sense of community, and in this case, the Amish are kind of, they're known to separate themselves in a lot of ways, not necessarily from others. Like there's definitely this sense of they seem to appreciate others who might have questions and be interested to learn. So there's that willingness to welcome in and talk and explain and share. But yeah, certainly a rejection of some of the modern conveniences and things. And that would be the difference between Amish and, say, Mennonite. Mennonites are more welcoming of some of modern technology. But the Amish, to me, when you set yourselves up like this, if it works to continue to create some of the things that the Beatitudes are talking about, then I'm good with it. But if it moves into a place where it's sort of holding people back from stepping into the fullness of their humanity. And I don't know that I could define what that is, but I think that there's places where we've seen how certain, and I don't mean to say this word and say, oh, that's what the Amish are, but we know the difference between a faith community that serves humanity and seeks for the growth of spirit within, and then a cult or something that sort of seeks to create control. And ultimately, that is about maintaining power over and using fear or other means to keep that control. There's just that difference. And again, I'm not saying that's what Amish are, but my general tact with different groups that might set themselves apart are if they are continuing to bless humanity and to connect to the deeper ways of seeing one another and benefiting a larger scale, and enacting love by standards that would say fit with these Beatitudes, then I think it's beautiful. It can be hard though to define, one versus the other. I admit that, and sometimes it takes a deep dive. And like you, I don't know all the ins and outs of how some of these communities operate, Bob. So that would be an impact. And I didn't watch, there's a show called Growing Up Amish or something like that. Well, maybe it wasn't that, but it was on like Netflix, or it was very popular for a while. And it was one of the deepest looks into the way that community operates. And it's something that a lot of us are not afforded. So that's important context. It's not called that though. Someone else, if you think of it, go ahead and share it, because I watched a few of them and I liked what I started to see. But Boyce?
The word judgment seems to come in, that if you have that behavior, that I don't think that's part of being pure in heart to me. And I think that that's something that many religions, even though they talk against it, they do judge. And so it's difficult if you grow up in those churches or whatever to be pure in heart, because
Yes.
You're constantly judging.
Well, and let's be careful about that. I agree with what you're saying, but just to maybe nitpick over terms, I think what you're describing is more a spirit of judgmentalism versus having judgments. I think we're all empowered to judge certain aspects of life, but that judgmentalism that can sort of separate and say, no, you're out when you do this, or when you say this or believe this, and you're in. That's not what this is about. And in fact, in the Beatitudes and in the whole of the Gospels, but I'll stick with Matthew in this case, since we've been located mostly in Matthew, it's never about creating this insider-outsider dynamic. It's always about Jesus is always focusing on how the outsiders are just as loved by God. So it's not about elevating these insiders for what they do, but it's kind of trying to make connections so that the whole dynamic between insider outsider might be just dispersed. But that judgmentalism certainly can impact the purity of our heart and our ability to see God and others, right? Because when you are judgmental, you will evaluate and dismiss oftentimes by your own standard. And I agree with you that unfortunately, within the creation of religions, that can and has happened quite often. the standards by which we judge one another are truly not the standards that we've been studying here, that they've been much more of a human created dynamic to often to preserve power.
One thing that I feel that our Bible study, each time we take a different section or whatever we're studying, to me, I just think, what was it like for those people to all of a sudden have this guy come in and start showing this new concept of God, and that the whole thing revolves around love? To me, the Beatitudes is an expression of how to behave in love.
Mm-hmm.
And so everything we've studied, it just reinforces that verse, God is love.
Yes.
And it just is, and I'm trying to, gosh, how we grew up that way, kind of saying that. But back in that day, they didn't. God was a vengeful and going to come in there and just rip everything apart and kill. And even today, there are people who say they are followers of God who still believe in killing.
Okay, I want to say thank you for that, first of all. But we often look at the Old Testament God as that vengeful God, and we have to just be more nuanced than that, I think, because there are obviously ample stories within the Old Testament of the God of love and liberation and peace that also are in and around those stories. I mean, the Exodus story itself has kind of all of those things, doesn't it? It's got both. But the experience of the people in the world was certainly one of violence. And so they often then express themselves and try to communicate their experience of God, utilizing what's been happening. And certainly the people in the time of Jesus, they knew the violence of the power of Rome. And the way Rome operated in the world was quite different than what Jesus was talking about. So that's the context that he stepped into. And you're absolutely right. That is just incredibly radical, liberating, and fear-inducing on the part of those who don't like these ways of talking. And look, here's the deal. We live 2,000 years later, and it is almost no different in terms of we live in a world that still practices the ways of Rome in order to maintain nation building and peace and all of that. And so it still puts us in those positions where to practice what Jesus is saying here is going to lead us down the path of persecution. It is not just connected to the context of Jesus' day. Yes, it was certainly true then, but we know it's true now. That's why we kill our prophets, because we don't like hearing what they have to say, because it means that things are going to have to change. And those who have power will have to lose their power if God's way is to hold sway, if we are actually going to live this. That's a challenge. And that will always remain a challenge, because I doubt we will ever see a country or any political party actually adopt these principles and abide by them in the way that Jesus is saying, because it is antithetical to empire. It's antithetical to our current model of nation, okay? And certainly nationalism. It's antithetical to that. It's creating a whole different way of being in the world. So it's not about us and them, you know? And we live in a world that still is about that. And you're absolutely right when you say that many Christians have this idea that there's such a thing as legitimate violence.
And when I say that, I'm judging.
But you're also just speaking truth. That's the reality. There's a lot of people that see violence, a lot of Christians who see certain violence as being acceptable. And
January 6th.
What was that? Yeah, there's that. There's
like January 6th.
But there's examples like just war. And, you know, and I know it's not easy. Dietrich Bonhoeffer is a classic example, who was a devout professor and minister, a Christian minister, who decided at the end, watching Hitler do what he was doing, that it had to be stopped. So he engaged in a plot of violence to thwart that for the sake of the greater good. Now, that was a very difficult decision. And a lot of just war theory has gone into, all right, well, what do we do in a situation like the Holocaust? And how do we respond to that? We're not going to get into that wholly here because it's just way too much of a conversation. But I recognize that that has been one of the struggles within Christianity. And I will say this, that the Beatitudes will bring us to this place, and we're about to talk about being a peacemaker, that Jesus very clearly and consistently identifies with the tact of nonviolence as a way of conflict resolution. So that is very important. If we're going to say that we are that we identify with and follow that message and that way of being, then that needs to inform the decisions we make in our larger scales. And that's one of those rub places, isn't it? Patty?
You say that we probably won't ever see that in our time, or maybe never, because there's always going to be tension between love and power. I think one of the things that I feel is Jesus is inviting us to a way of being with a clear mind and clear heart, where the kingdom of heaven is within us.
Yes.
And when that happens to you, then that dichotomy, it isn't erased outside of you, but it's erased inside of you. And when that happens, you have that sense of eminence and you can be the reflection. I think that's more optimistic for me than to say, we're never going to get there, because I have to get there somehow. I mean, yes. And that's the call for me.
Well, no, I think you're absolutely right. All I'm saying is we will not get there through our current process and model of nation building. But we can get there by a process of breaking down the assumptions we have and the things we aspire to. And one of them is, as you just said, what do we think of when we think of heaven? We think it's something, we still do. We talk about this all the time, but I imagine there's some of us in this group today who still think of heaven as a place to get to after we die. And that how we live in our lives is going to earn us that. And we look at the Beatitudes, a lot of us have been taught, and again, this isn't accusing, this is how it's lifted up in so many places. We're taught that, well, these are the 9 ways or 8 ways that we can be, kind of get to heaven. This is how we live. This is what it's called. We're called to. Look, that may or may not be true, but the point of these is not about getting to heaven. And we'll get to, at the end, we'll talk about, well, what is the point then? We'll talk about that because I want to, let's percolate on all this more and kind of get through the rest of them. But yeah, we can fall into those traps, but I agree with you that they become possible when we really do the work within ourselves and break down the assumptions we make, the expectations we have, those things that we strive for and desire, and really align ourselves with what he's talking. And let go of the hungers and the thirsts for accolades and material possessions and power and money and houses and cars, and really strive for then, what does it mean to then deeply hunger and thirst for the ways of righteousness and the ways of justice? What does that mean? That's where this becomes real. And I'm glad you said this, Patty, because it's not about trying to be pessimistic here. It's trying to recognize that Jesus knew, and I think we still know today, that the way we get there is not going to be by waiting for countries and politicians and power to make the change. No, it's just not going to happen that way. It's going to have to be a different way, and it starts with our own inner assessments. Anyone else before we move on to the next one? Horty?
I don't know whether anyone else happened to watch in the presidential debates when Marianne Williamson was present. And she just stayed so almost naively, innocently present with the way is love. The way is love. And people are talking about geopolitical power and, what's economics. And she was very simply and very present. And you sort of think, why would somebody like Marianne Williamson even, think about running for president? And I thought, how brave of her just to say, I just want to put in this vote here as we're looking at ways of moving forward in our country and our world. I just want to say there's the possibility of love. That is the way. And she was so simple in the way she just kept saying that. I thought, this is pretty remarkable that somebody within the arena and making this present.
Right.
I was really struck by what you said, pardon me, about childhood and folks, all of us moving into adolescence, and that maybe being one of the first places where we really recognize separation and we begin to see the possibility of inadequacy, starting with ourselves. I'm not as cool, I don't have the right sneakers, da 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 da. Where we begin to see separation and we begin to see judgment, and how often the world is progressing at a pretty adolescent level. Where things are different, where things are separated, where things are more than, where things are less than. And a lot of it really begins with, I'm less than.
Yes.
I need to get more so I can be as good or better or whatever. And when we look at our world today, it feels often pretty adolescent.
I would agree 100%. And, there's a difference between the way, you can see, we do fall into that trap, just to pick up on one thing you said there, of learning to see ourselves as less than. But the beatitude of being poor in spirit is more about seeing ourselves as not greater than. You see the difference? And when we can learn to do that, it means that we're not elevating ourselves or denigrating ourselves, but seeing ourselves as one whole, as a greater connection of humanity. That, to me,
and as you say, that's more the vision of childhood.
Yes, that's not more pure in
place
heart.
Of separation, which is inaccurate. And maybe the task of moving through childhood and adulthood into the wisdom place of the elderly is regaining that acceptance of childhood, of we are all the same. We all have a sense of, oops, I goofed, and wow, I did great. And that doesn't make you any better or any worse. It makes you whole, as every other person on the planet is whole.
And it makes you, it connects you to your humanity. And that to me touches on, at least in part, some of the comments that Marilyn made at the beginning, that as her experience of her life and the arc, is that she's reached a certain stage where that acceptance and that new perspective is kind of opening up and seeing in those more pure ways, those childlike ways that maybe we used to touch on. Bonnie, did I see your hand up too?
Yeah, I hope I'm not going off on a tangent. There's a verse in the Bible, and I don't remember where it is, or the context, but it's something about man looks on the outward appearance, but God looks on the heart. And I don't know if any of you saw, there was a 2-hour special last week. I think it was on PBS on Billy Graham. And if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. I thought it was excellent. It was eye-opening. But the one thing that related to me in this context was Graham's relationship to Richard Nixon. And I think Nixon presented himself as a very upright Christian man to Billy Graham in all their contexts of their discussions and so forth. But once Watergate happened and Graham sort of saw this other side, then Richard Nixon cut off all contact. But I think a lot of times we can see someone and think what they're presenting is what they want us to see. That may not be the total picture.
Bonnie, one of the things I love about you is you'll often give pretext to your comments by saying just what you did. I hope it's not too far off base, but it's always connected. So I'm not going to tell you need to stop, because that's part of that, what makes you you. But here's the thing. The answer is yes, that so often, right? We love the prophets who are in our midst, so Billy Graham in this example, when they are speaking our language and when they're not challenging us and when we can just kind of keep doing what we're doing with their sort of approval, that is gold to most of us in our lives. We love having people like that. A lot of people love their minister when their minister is complimentary or comforting. But when the minister starts preaching a little bit of sandpaper, that's like, ow, or a little bit of a zing here, or starts to shift things and move towards justice, we tend to not like that so much. When those we rely on for deepest advice start to challenge us, hey, sometimes that's what we're looking for. If we're really in it for the right reasons, that is necessary. That's what a true friend does, for example. But so often in these dynamics, like what you named with Billy Graham and Richard Nixon, so when power and priesthood come together, call it that, that's where it can be really dangerous, because we've seen how many times we could probably all come up with multiple examples. The relationship between the emperors and the popes throughout the Middle Ages, and what that wrought for the people and for religion, and the rules that were created in order to help that work better. We saw stories about, how David loved Jonathan. Was it Jonathan? No. Oh, shoot. The prophet that says, you are the man, who finally came out and accused him of what he really did in the Bathsheba story. Was it Jonathan? Why am I forgetting? Anyway.
Naaman.
What was it?
Naaman.
It was Naaman? Okay. The prophet Naaman, who accused him, who just came right out and said it. David didn't like that so much, even though it was right. It was right. So this is what happens. Those dynamics happen. And that's the risk of bringing power in relation to some of these prophetic words, is that when you don't like them, you treat them like John the Baptist. Okay. Or MLK, or any of them that we've seen in our lifetimes. Let's move into then this next one, because I want to kind of keep rolling here. But the whole blessed are the peacemakers. This is the only time in the entire Bible that the word peacemaker is used. Yeah. So blessed are the peacemakers. How would you talk about what it means to be a peacemaker, and what's the difference between being a peacemaker and a peacekeeper?
One's active, one's passive.
Yeah, that's a quick way of saying it. Absolutely. I also saw your hand up, Patty.
Well, in my Aramaic translation, they talk about peacemakers at that time were people who helped solve problems for ordinary people, because there were judges appointed. There weren't very many, and they weren't paid well, and they tended to go with the people who paid them more or bribed them. The peacemakers sat at the gates. They didn't get paid, and they resolved problems for people. And I didn't ever know what that meant. I mean, I thought that was amazing, but that was a tradition at the time of Jesus. And so these people are the people that are trying to help the community resolve their problems without bribes, without bias. And that's the argument that he offered, one of them, as peacemakers.
Yeah, and without violence, and that's the thing. To be a peacemaker, as Horty said in consult or in connection with what you just said, Patty, to be a peacemaker is active. It's an active role. To be a peacekeeper, much more passive. And peacekeeping is really only maintaining an absence of conflict. Okay, so that's why we name missiles. Okay, we have missiles that are named peacekeepers. Okay, they are not peacemakers, they're peacekeepers. In what standard? In the Pax Romana standard. Okay, in the way of peace through violence, that's how you do it, with missiles and with that sort of strength, military strength. When Jesus talks about being a peacemaker, he is talking about a completely different way of understanding what peace is and how to utilize power. He is throwing a lot at them in one small beatitude, but really aligning himself once again with that whole, that way of nonviolence in the world, in a world then and now that was sort of just overrun by violence, run by control and fear. and the means of wielding power as a weapon against and domination over.
When I was in seminary,
Yep. Go ahead.
when I was in seminary, my practical experience was with a group called Pace e Bene, which means peace and good. And their whole program was about teaching us to be peacemakers. And which is an extremely involved kind of thing. It's you don't get it right away. But one of the parts of it that I really liked was the 8 stages of change, and how the stick-to-itiveness of a peacemaker is really critical. And that when you're changing people's minds, especially their paradigms, you can't expect it to be fast. And right before the change occurs, it looks like chaos is going to happen. And that's that was very, very comforting to me when I was participating in their program, because it allowed me to have faith in the places where there looked like no faith was possible.
Yeah.
In terms of change. And they're working all over the world, the Pace Bene group, and they go to the demonstrations to help keep peace, like with the Black Lives Matter and that kind of thing. Their posture is great, but they have a program. The first part was called Engage, and the other one was called Engaging Nonviolence. It's an amazing program, totally cool. This church, our church, might be interested in it at some point, because
I think so. Yeah.
It's skill building in terms of nonviolence. It's just amazing program.
Well, and I think that persistence, you used the word persistence, creating a persistent means of staying in this and on this path. That's something that Jesus is clearly aware of. That's why what follows this makes so much sense, because he knows to be a peacemaker leads to persecution. He knows it requires stick-to-itiveness. He knows that he personally is going to face all sorts of things. He's seen it already in his community. He knows he lives in a world of violence, one that doesn't just accept these changes that he's proposing. He knows what's at stake, and stick-to-itiveness is one of the most important qualities here. And when you think back to examples in our own lifetime, with the civil rights movement and the message of MLK, it wasn't the walk across Selma, it wasn't the big speeches that did it all. I mean, they were important parts. They started to grease the skids or to make supple the soil. But what was it that turned the hearts? It was when Bull Connor turned those darn hoses on children that finally broke the will. And so, like you talk about chaos, it was complete chaos. But when they did that, that seems to have shifted the tide, and almost overnight. Now, I could be misstating it somewhat, but there was a quick, like a shift there that happened because of people just finally had enough in trying to hold on to this idea that there could be a justice or a rightness in the other side, or the view that the Bull Connors of the world had. And know that because of the persistent way of nonviolence that the civil rights movement maintained, it became compelling to a point where people finally kind of copped on or came aboard. And I think that's very much in alignment with what you were saying there with Pace e Bene. Is that it? Pace e Bene? Yeah, that approach.
Francis said.
Yes, thank you.
And I have to go get my battery recharged, so I'm going to go get the things because it's going to go off, and I don't want it to go off because I love this.
Okay. All righty. We'll see you when you get back. Bonnie?
It made me think of Jimmy Carter when he sat down with Begin and Sadat, and to bring them together to settle issues by peace rather than violence. And of course, Sadat ended up getting assassinated.
Right.
And so sometimes standing up for peace, could ultimately cost you your life in that case. Everybody isn't going to always agree with you, that's for certain. But that was just the first thing that popped in my mind. And if you followed Carter's life, I mean, that seems to be the example of what he has continued to do.
Yeah.
And serve people through peace, through peaceful means.
He's been committed to that and very motivated by his faith. And here's the thing, I think you're absolutely right. To stand up for these principles, to speak about and live into the ways of justice, to talk about these things, and to dare to do so on a political scale and talk about policy in that way. That definitely sets you up for persecution, but more than that, life-threatening, no question. And look at the tactics, because they're fairly consistent. When you hear people kind of like complaining about or going against the talk of justice and human dignity, you know, social justice, that term, they are not talking about what it actually means, but they'll start to throw labels at it. They'll impugn the speaker. They'll call it communism. They'll call it anything to sort of devalue it, but they can't assail the principles behind it, or they're just not able to. And that's the key. You'll see how they will assail the speaker and dehumanize them, belittle them, dismiss them in ways that make it possible to like still maintain their own worldview and not feel threatened or challenged by the worldview of the peacemaker. But the truth is, to speak and advocate for peace is definitely can and will set you up for some measure of persecution, and even life-threatening persecution. Absolutely, that's how it remains. And that's why, again, the Gospels talk about it for so long, and they emphasize it so much, because people, it takes a lot of courage and persistence and recognition, to do that. A lot of us approach this idea of faith or having a relationship with God as if it's going to make our lives honky-dory, and it's going to just like make us feel good and lead to a great life. And that all may be true, but it's certainly different than what we anticipate a lot of times when we say that. And the pastor, Nadia Bolz-Weber, who's a minister in the Denver area, she's got all sorts of tattoos. She's very hip. She's really interesting, writes a lot of great books. But she said, the reality is we all talk like we want a relationship with God, but me, I don't want anything to do with God, because every time I get close to God, God's asking me to love someone I don't like, or invite someone in who I just don't want to be near. All these things, God is constantly breaking down the barriers and the divisions that I set up. And I know that to invite God in is to break that all down. So am I ready for that? Well, that's exactly the tact that Matthew is giving us with these Beatitudes. You really want to follow Jesus? Okay, here's what it looks like. And yeah, it's tough. And yeah, it's going to put things on the line for you. But it's not just for sadism. It's not just because we're masochists, not sadism, masochism, where we want to just go put ourselves out there so we can be, fodder for the cannons of this world. No, it's because there's something greater at stake. And because Jesus knows, in the same way that our prophets know, that this is how you institute this way of being in the world. You can't go through the regular channels of politics and nations and war and government and armies. It has to be a different way. And it's possible, but it's hard. And it will ask a lot of us. It will ask everything of us. So you really want to walk this walk? He's trying to be forthright with us. Anyone else? As we're talking about finishing up with blessed are the peacemakers. Well, it follows that the next one or the next two go right into that idea of blessed are those who are persecuted for the cause of justice. The kingdom of heaven is theirs. And what's interesting about this one, and really the one that follows it too, the one about the disciples, this one and the first one, the poor in spirit one, are the only two where the response, okay, blessed are those for, the for part is in the present tense. All the other ones are, blessed are these, for they will inherit this or will be this later. But the only ones that are in the present tense, and the present tense in both cases is, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven, those who are poor in spirit and those who are persecuted for the sake of justice. So I want you to reflect on that. What is that saying to us about what the kingdom of heaven is? That's the only thing that he refers to in terms of response. That's in the present tense. And then what does it mean? What is this beatitude, saying to us when he's talking about blessed are those who are persecuted for justice? Any thoughts or comments? I know, don't you love it when I lay something like that on you and then say, okay, immediately reflect and talk. It's not easy, but that's why it's good to have a video, because then you can go back and kind of think about it later if you want to. Any thoughts on what this is about? What he's leading them to? Yes, Patty.
I think he's leading them to love, in the sense that to live within love allows you to have a stance isn't exactly right, but a different perspective of heaven that's inside of you, that is active, and so that if you are living poor in spirit, and if you're living with willingness to engage nonviolently, the basic thing that you have to do is love, is you have to live it all the time. And my guy here that I'm reading said, can I read this just quickly?
Please do. Yeah.
Love alone can create a just and universal social order. Love is impartial, inclusive, and universal. Despite this fact, the new gospel was like a sword. It would divide people, and there would be reproach and persecution. Many would reject the powerful truth and ideas that Jesus taught. His followers would suffer, but great is their reward in heaven. A heavenly reward means a reward that never dies. It is eternal. It is an Aramaic way of speaking that means your reward is assured. The enactment of God's kingdom through Jesus' disciples and followers would live forever. Generations to come would bless, praise, and remember them, because these men and women dared to reveal and live a new way of life. And that life is through love. And you have to be poor in spirit for that. And also you have to be willing to endure rejection.
And when we are living in that way of love, as you say, then we are living into and experiencing the kingdom of heaven now in the present. And you know what that also means? That there is no violence or power or worldly agent that can take that away from us. No one can take that from you. So when you live in these ways, yeah, the world will hate you. The world will persecute you. The world might even kill you, but they cannot take your experience, the reality, the truth, that the kingdom of heaven is in that way of being. That is the kingdom of heaven. And it reminds me in some ways, and I know that might not sound perfect, so this is the example that came to me. So many of our spirituals emerged from the slave days, when in the midst of bitter oppression and control over people, they could not stop their songs. And they would sing constantly in fields, in anywhere, and lift up that truth that would be a source not only of song and joy, and that was part of it, but of naming something that no slave master could ever take from them. And there's something to that. There's something that's so powerful and important to the human spirit and to the meaning of faith and the reality of God's kingdom in our lives, that there are certain things that nobody can touch. And so by living into these, we access that way, that reality. And yeah, it doesn't mean that everything's good. We still will be hurt. We still will be persecuted. We still might die. But no one can take from us that possibility for joy. Other comments or thoughts? Margaret, and then Bonnie. I want to hear you. Can you hit the space bar and hold it? Is that working? Hold it down. Oh, I don't hear you. It's not allowing me to unmute either. It just says that I can ask you to unmute. Come back, Margaret, if you can, because I want to hear what you have to say, but for the sake of,
Now?
oh, there you
Can
go.
you-
Yeah.
Okay, you were saying, you were mentioning about songs lift up. So I have a question just for you.
I know what this
Why
is going to
don't-
be.
What, when you say my name, what do you think of?
How great
Do
thou
you
art.
have- Right. So why don't we sing that? Because it tells everyone how great God is.
We
I'm
will.
done.
We will. I
Oh.
love you, Margaret. And that is exactly what I think of every time we sing.
Yeah, I know. Well, that's a good thing. Other people think of other things, and that's not complimentary. But anyway, I would love to come to church, but I just can't hear when everybody's wearing masks or outside. But I'm going to come when things get normal.
Oh, I don't know if we're ever going to be normal again, Margaret. But no, we will
Oh,
be back inside and you'll be able to hear. We'll be back inside soon in the next couple weeks. Probably by I think the 20th is when we'll definitely move in. We may move inside before that if it's super hot or if it's raining,
Yeah.
which I don't think is going to happen, but that's all. So we're going to stay outside just because of certain people have said, younger families have said they want to meet outside still. So we
Yeah.
look forward to seeing you again.
That's fine.
Yeah.
But you know, when you say in your sermons, when you say something I agree with, I think he's right on.
Yeah.
And then you mention something that I didn't think of. Then I think, why is he saying that? It gives me a lot of thought. Really, I have to think about it. Okay, I'm done.
Well, thank you. And thank you for being open to considering new ideas, because that's the starting place, is to cultivate a way of being that allows the thoughts and the impact of others to get in. And you give me a lot of trust as your minister to do that. So thank you. Thank you. And I hope that, because to me, I think that's a very healthy and life-giving way to be. Bonnie, did you want to follow up?
Well, hard to follow, Margaret. No, the only thing that I thought of when you were mentioning the slaves and their singing was the spiritual, gonna lay down my burdens down by the riverside and study war no more. And I think the next verse then is, I'm gonna walk with the Prince of Peace. So even in their situation, I think they were thinking not war, but peace, which if anybody had a right to think about war, you would think it would be them thinking about rising up in violence. But I think peace was also on their minds, maybe even more so than violence.
Certainly was. In their songs, it reflects the spirit of conflict resolution that Jesus espoused, that is espoused in these Beatitudes, that's espoused in the parables and the stories of each gospel. And so that's an important piece. That's why in some ways these songs are so enduring, is because they speak directly into an experience that's horrific. It's horrific. And yet they still maintained a faith, a persistence to not allow their masters or the realities of the world to completely remove their capacity for letting God in and for experiencing the joy that still was there. Doesn't mean it's obviously not perfect and not everything is joyful, but joy is not something that is the same as happiness or comfort, or, joy can happen despite the worst. despite the struggles. Okay, so that's part of what this is inviting the disciples towards. Be joyful, rejoice, and be glad, it says. That's not saying, oh, thank you, God, for these, or thank you for the wounds and stuff. No, it's not. That's masochism. It's more about recognizing that, yeah, the world can do what it will, but it can't take certain things from me. And that is my joy. And that's reflective of that spirit that led to a lot of the spirituals that are still so poignant in our song canon. Go ahead, Horty.
Who comes to mind is Viktor Frankl.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and
you do have complete control over, it doesn't feel like we do, but we really have complete control over how we respond to any situation.
Yeah, it's so true. And a lot of the prophets and the voices and the authors and the speakers who emerged out of the Holocaust as well, to speak to the horrors of that, what abides is that recognition that to meet the evil of the Third Reich was not to respond in kind, but also to recognize that the anger that is inside of us about that is totally acceptable, and to express that anger is important so that we can move into ways of living and being that are different than that, but not to let it control us. And even there are certain things that no agent of death or hatred can take from us. And that's some of what's so poignant about the stories that have emerged from that time. Patty?
I was
There you
thinking
go.
about what you said.
Yeah.
I was thinking about what you said, Horty, and I think the idea of choice happens when you have a clear mind and heart. I think when we have patterns that we've practiced forever, like violence, like carrying guns, like solving things that way, it's really hard, and it takes a great deal of effort to relearn how to respond automatically as a peacemaker. And especially if people have trauma. I mean, I think, and are guarded. And I mean, that's my experience with my patients. And it's my experience with Pachibeni too, and myself. That learning to meditate, for example, and to slow down so that there's a space between the feeling and the action. That's a huge change. You don't get that automatically unless you're taught from the time you're little. And so that choice idea is true. I think we all have choices, but part of it is training ourselves not to do what we've been taught by our culture so much.
Yes.
And that's very antithetical to power.
And I think that's a good summary of what the Beatitudes are about. They're a training. Okay. They're not something that's easy to step into. They're a way of seeing and being in the world that is different than the cultures that are often trying to inform us that this is the way. Jesus is then saying, no, this is the way. And we have that choice. It doesn't just happen. We step into these ways of being. We step into this path in which we walk. And so that's kind of where we're left with now as we consider all these Beatitudes, all these different ways of being in the world and with, or in alignment with Jesus and truly with one another. What are we left with? What is your takeaway from, what's the impact when we do these things? So what is it about? What happens? Okay. It's not about a ticket to heaven. We've established that. We've talked about how a lot of us were raised, or we have this internalization that, well, when we live this way, it means we're going to live into eternity with God, or, that whole heaven pearly gates thing. I'm not completely dismissing that. That may be true. I don't know. But it's not the intention of the Beatitudes, at least according to Matthew. So what is the intention then? What is the impact of living this way? Bob?
Well, you make it sound like a new 10 Commandments.
Yeah, and I think there's something intentional there about sending Jesus to a mountain in a gospel that aligns him with as being the new Moses, and having, 8 or 9 or roughly something that's akin to the commandments, because that's true, and it's important that we see that the commandments were a way of being. You don't just fall into that. They're practices, but this is much different. This is a much more challenging approach to how we are asked to be. But it's also an effective way of summarizing the message and the mission of Jesus. Oh, you want to know? Oh, sure, I can tell you exactly what it looks like. Not exclusively. It's not. This isn't everything, but this is a good idea, a good summary of you want to follow Jesus? Okay, here, practice this, and chew on it, and let's talk about it. Let's move through it together, because it's not just going to happen. Like we've been saying, you got to be taught. You got to be carefully taught, persistently taught to keep engaged in this, no matter what all the ups and downs might be. What are some other results from this, impacts that you can see living this way, and just summary comments that you might have? Horty?
I'm digressing, but for several moments as we've been talking about this, this is the antithesis of the song in South Pacific. You've got to be carefully taught to be afraid of people whose eyes are oddly made. You have to be carefully taught to hate and to fear all the people that your relatives fear. You have to be carefully taught. So this is, for me, the antithesis of that. This is how to be carefully taught. And as you say, it's not you read it once and you got it. It's that maybe you reread it every day or several times a day. And I don't mean that absolutely literally, but revisit what is it you learned in each one of the Beatitudes in any moment when you're faced with conflict. And it would be easy to go off at your spouse, at your kid, at your cat, whatever. Am I living into the Beatitudes that we just studied? Am I bringing them into the practice in my life?
Yes.
When we see cruelty or inequality in the world, what am I called to do? Just as Patty was saying, when through meditation, you're taught that there's a heartbeat of difference between stimulus and response. And the response can be different than to react. React is almost a neurophysiological response, but response is that which you, as a maturing soul human being, can bring forth from ongoing enactment of the study of the Beatitudes, I believe.
And it is an ongoing thing. You're absolutely right. Because if it's not about a ticket to heaven, the pearly gates, then what it is about is these practices, these ways of being in the world, describe what a free life looks like, what the possibility of a full life looks like, according to God's definition of what a full life is. They're not prescriptions. They're not do this and you're going to feel great. No. They're descriptions. They don't lead us to a destination. They are a destination. And so, in other words, when we live in ways that are in alignment with the people around us, those who are struggling, so when we are poor in spirit, when we are with one another and seeing one another, when we are capable of weeping, when we are able to be persecuted and still find joy somehow, okay? When we can live into these things, then we know we're on the path with Jesus. And that itself is the kingdom of heaven. Go. Barbara?
And I'm thinking that I'm not muted. I'm also thinking of connection to the universe and to not just humans but all of creation as God makes it, that this is part of an extension of holding hands with everything.
Yes, it's such a good point. You raised the issue of that it's not just about human dynamics here. This is about balance. This is about, you could call it holiness, because holiness it has this attitude of balance, but of wholeness. It's that when we live in these patterns, in these ways, it puts us in alignment, not just with other human beings, but with all creation. And when we live that way, it redefines our whole sense of what power is. We've talked about, okay, it's not dominance over, it's not using it for our own means willy-nilly. It's about using it in a different way, about understanding a different way or a strategy of power. Okay. And here's the challenge, because what Matthew describes here, this apparent way that God and Jesus use power, that feels like powerlessness. That feels like the absence of power, and it sort of is by the definitions we're taught and by the ways of the world. But that rub is one of the places that when we can get through, when we can understand more deeply and not get thrown by that, but step into that with trust, with persistence, with practice, with community, that's when we will find the freedom in our lives that God intends. And that's when he talks about being the salt of the earth, being the lights, he's recognizing that this is, in some ways, salt is a powerful spice at that time. It's a preservative. It's what allows you to transport food from faraway places, so you get to have more. But salt is something that you only need a little bit to season or to preserve a lot. So it's like he's saying that, look, I know that my followers at this time, to really do this is going to be kind of like salt. Like, it may not be everybody that does this. Okay. But for those who do, this is where freedom will be found. This is where liberation will be found. This is where love will be found. And where those things are found, that's the kingdom of God. Patty?
One of the things that is meaningful to me is the notion of community, that the solutions are not mine to make all by myself, and I'm not in charge of all the changes and all the. But in community, I can enter into that place that in Aramaic, instead of blessed, they say blissful. Blissful are those who have these processes. And the bliss is about release from being totally responsible for all the problems in the world, but being a participant in community with the notion that in community, we are the body of Christ. We are Christ, and we don't have to solve everything with every single part of our body. We can be a part. And we don't have to even understand it all, because if you're in a state of bliss, I don't know if I have. If you have a blissful state, you're really at peace. It's a sense of integrity that you're living. And I think that's partly, for me, that's what is speaking to me.
Yeah. And I think Jesus recognizes that that's where true bliss, where true joy comes from, is in a way of service, in a way of connection, in a way of more broad-minded communal seeing, instead of, oh, my bliss comes from acquiring and striving and my own being number one, that sort of thing. That moving away from those definitions, which lead us down the path of competition and division and separation, what he's talking about is a whole different approach to what it means to be with one another and to live in that, sense of wholeness. And it will constantly challenge us, and it will constantly throw us into maybe at least conversation, but also into opposition with our culture and maybe with our loved ones. It could do that. And that's where Jesus says, I bring a sword, because he recognizes that to do this is to create division in the old models of doing things. He's breaking that down, but he's giving us language and practices that help keep us on a path. And it's not to force us there. It's a choice. But here's what I'm about. Here's what we're about. And let's walk this walk together. This is where you will find your deepest fulfillment and your freedom in what it means to be alive. That's big. That's
Yeah.
big. And the rest of the gospel kind of continues that. I mean, it leads us out to what, Matthew 25, the sheep and the goats. Matthew is always saying, I need you to take it up a notch. The Jesus in Matthew is like, the world needs people who are willing to stand up and say, this matters and you matter. And the things I do, the people I feed, the people I see, the people I speak to and love, they matter to me because they matter to God. Matthew's always pushing those buttons. The Beatitudes certainly are intended to push our buttons. But hopefully, what we'll see in that button pushing is not something that leads us to this and dismissal, but into, wow, I see now, or I see the possibility for something bigger than I've ever considered. So yeah, sign me up. Horty?
I want to thank Patty for bringing in the sense of the Beatitudes, drawing us into community, because that's the next step. And it makes me wonder if we might consider our next study being Matthew.
Yeah, we could do Matthew again. We have got some time to consider that. I'm going to take a break for the summer. I customarily do. It's a little earlier this year, but because of the shape of some of these classes, it's not always easy to create a 5-week or 6-week. This one happened to be a 3-session. But yeah, and given travel schedules and other factors, we'll be taking a break until mid-August. So please do send me any recommendations or thoughts on what you'd like to do. As far as we could do the Gospel of Matthew, but if there's anything else, please send it to me. If we don't do it immediately, I'll just consider it for another time because, we keep going and it's okay. We've already studied Matthew, but it was years ago. We're different now, and the conversations we have about these things are always sort of subject to the composition of the group that's in it together. So I'm open to all things. So please send me an email with any of those. But other than that, I just want to, as always, say thank you for your persistence and consistency with this. For anyone that's been watching online, it is a real blessing to be able to have these conversations so often like this. They are enriching on an academic level, but on a life and a heart level and a faith level. So thank you all for helping to shape that space that I know so many of us benefit from. So I look forward to seeing you in other places in the meantime, but in this particular place sometime in mid-August. So stay tuned.
We'll miss seeing all your sweet smiling faces on a weekly basis.
Ditto. Blessings all.
Thank you.